The Great Hall of the Galactic Assembly had never been this quiet. Representatives from 12 species sat in their designated sections, but nobody spoke. The holographic display in the center showed the same terrifying image it had shown for the past 3 days. A massive swarm of biological ships moving through space like a dark cloud, consuming everything in their path. The Keth had returned. Ambassador Rillen stood at the central podium, her blue-gray skin pale with exhaustion. She had not slept in 4 days. None of them had. The Varani diplomat looked around the hall at the faces of beings she had known for decades, and she saw the same expression on all of them. Fear. 4 colonies, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 4 colonies in 12 days. 18 billion lives gone. And our combined fleet could not slow them down for even 1 hour. A heavy silence followed her words. The Tannic delegation shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The insectoid Kreeth made soft clicking sounds that their translators interpreted as distress. Even the normally stoic Draven representatives looked shaken. Fleet Commander Narth of the Varani military stepped forward. He was old for his species, with deep lines across his face that spoke of too many battles and too many losses. Our projections show the swarm will reach the inner systems within 60 days. We have begun evacuation protocols, but we do not have enough transport ships. We cannot save everyone. Then we fight, said a Kreeth commander, his mandibles clicking rapidly. We throw everything we have at them. We tried that, North replied quietly. At the Battle of Cephas Prime, we lost 200 warships in less than an hour. The Keth did not lose a single vessel. The hall erupted in desperate chatter. Species that had been allies for centuries began arguing among themselves. Some called for surrender. Others demanded a final stand. A few suggested fleeing to the outer rim and hoping the swarm would not follow. In the corner of the hall, an elderly Tannic scholar named Harrix listened to the chaos with tired eyes. He was not a military leader or a politician. He was a keeper of old stories, a historian who spent his life studying the legends and myths of the galaxy. Most considered his work useless, entertaining perhaps, but not practical. But as he listened to his people argue about their extinction, an old memory stirred in his mind. Harrix rose slowly from his seat. His joints ached, and his voice was not as strong as it once was. But when he spoke, something in his tone made the others fall silent. There is another option, he said. One that nobody has considered because everyone believes it to be impossible. Ambassador Rillen turned to face him. Speak, scholar. At this point, we will consider anything. Harrix walked toward the center of the hall, his footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. When I was young, my grandmother told me stories. Tales passed down through generations older than our written records. She spoke of a species from a distant, forgotten sector of the galaxy. A species so strange and so terrifying that our ancestors erased all records of their location, hoping never to encounter them again. What species? North asked, his eyes narrowing. They called themselves humans. A murmur went through the assembly. Some of the older representatives nodded slowly, as if remembering half-forgotten childhood tales. Others looked confused, never having heard the word before. Humans are myths, said a Draven ambassador dismissively. Stories told to frighten children. They are not real. That is what I believed as well, Harrix admitted. But the stories were remarkably consistent across multiple species. They spoke of creatures from a death world, a planet so hostile that most life forms would perish within hours. Extreme temperatures, deadly radiation, predators everywhere, and violent geological events. According to the legends, humans did not merely survive on this world. They thrived. They conquered it. He paused, looking around the hall at the skeptical faces. The stories say that humans were impossible to kill. Cut off a limb, and they would keep fighting. Poison them, and their bodies would adapt. Starve them, and they would eat things no other species could digest. But what made them truly terrifying was not their physical resilience. It was their minds. Harrick's voice dropped lower, and despite themselves, the assembly leaned forward to listen. Humans, according to the old tales, were strategic geniuses. They fought wars among themselves for thousands of years, developing tactics and weapons that no peaceful species could imagine. But here's the strangest part. They also formed bonds. Deep, unbreakable bonds with other species, even with creatures that should have been their prey or their predators. They would fight to the death for beings they had just met, simply because those beings needed help. That makes no logical sense, the Kreeth commander clicked. Why would any species risk itself for strangers? I do not know, Harrick said honestly. The legends say humans operated on principles they called honor and loyalty. Concepts that we have no equivalent for in our languages. Fleet Commander North shook his head slowly. Even if these humans existed once, they are clearly gone now. If they were as warlike as you describe, they probably destroyed themselves. Many species have. Perhaps, Harrick agreed. But there is one piece of evidence that suggests otherwise. He turned to a young Varani technician named Selith, who had been quietly working at a data terminal throughout the meeting. She looked up, startled to find everyone's attention on her. Show them, Harrick said gently. Selith hesitated, then projected something onto the main display. It was a signal, old, corrupted, barely readable. But buried within the static was a pattern. A repeating sequence that was clearly artificial, clearly intentional. I found this in our oldest archives, Selith explained nervously. Files that had not been accessed in over 10,000 years. The signal contains coordinates to a specific star system. And it contains a message in a language that no translator can decode. You want us to send a distress call to a myth? The Draven ambassador laughed bitterly. This is foolishness. What else do we have? Ambassador Rillen asked quietly. She looked around the hall, at the fear and despair on every face. What do we lose by trying? Nobody could answer that question. That night, against the recommendation of every logical advisor, Selith transmitted a distress call toward the coordinates in the ancient signal. She included everything: the Keth attacks, the casualties, the desperate situation. She sent it in every language the Alliance knew, hoping that one of them might be understood. Then she waited. 1 day passed. Then 2. Then 3. The Council resumed its evacuation planning. The military prepared for a final, hopeless stand. Nobody spoke of the transmission anymore. It had been a desperate fantasy, nothing more. On the 4th day, the long-range sensors detected something. It came from the direction of the ancient coordinates, from a sector of space that had been marked as empty and unexplored for millennia. At first, it was just a single point of light. Then another. Then 10. Then 100. An entire fleet emerged from the darkness of uncharted space, and they were heading straight for Vareth Prime. The orbital defense platforms around Vareth Prime powered up their weapons as the unknown fleet approached. Every warship in the system moved to intercept positions. After 3 days of waiting and hoping, nobody had expected anything to actually arrive. And now that something had, the first instinct was fear. Fleet Commander North stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the scanner displays with growing unease. The readings made no sense. The approaching vessels were running on primitive fusion reactors, technology that the Alliance had abandoned thousands of years ago. Their hull designs were crude, almost ugly, with strange angles and what appeared to be additional armor plates welded directly onto the exterior. But the weapon signatures were something else entirely. "Commander," his tactical officer reported, voice trembling slightly. "Those ships are carrying enough firepower to destroy our entire fleet 3 times over. And they are still accelerating." How is that possible? North demanded. Their propulsion systems are ancient. I do not know, sir. But they will be in weapons range in approximately 4 minutes. North closed his eyes for a moment, thinking about the legends Harrix had shared. Death World survivors. Warriors who fought for strangers. Creatures that should not exist. All ships, hold positions, he ordered. Do not fire unless fired upon. And open a communication channel. For a long moment, nothing happened. The unknown fleet continued its approach, silent and intimidating. Then, suddenly, every speaker in every ship crackled to life. A voice came through, calm, professional, and speaking accented but understandable common galactic. It was a female voice, and something about its tone made North's spine straighten instinctively. This is Admiral Lisa Harmon of the United Earth Defense Fleet, responding to your distress signal. We received your message and have come to offer assistance against the Keth swarm. Please identify yourselves and provide current threat assessment. The bridge fell completely silent. North realized his hands were shaking slightly. He steadied himself and replied, Admiral Harmon, this is Fleet Commander North of the Galactic Alliance. We did not expect anyone to respond. Many of us believed your species was a myth. There was a brief pause, and then a sound came through the speakers that nobody could identify at first. It took a moment to realize the human was laughing softly. We get that a lot, Admiral Harmon said. Permission to send a delegation to discuss the situation in person? Within the hour, a small human shuttle docked with the main station above Verith Prime. Ambassador Rillen had assembled the full council to receive their guests, though nobody quite knew what to expect. The stories described monsters, predators, creatures of nightmare. What walked through the airlock was something entirely different. Admiral Lisa Harmon was smaller than most of the species present, with dark hair streaked with gray and a face lined with experience. She wore a simple military uniform, dark blue with minimal decoration. Behind her came two others, a younger male introduced as Lieutenant Kevin Cho, and a heavily built soldier named Captain Derek Santos. The three humans stopped at the entrance to the council chamber, and for a moment, nobody moved. The assembled species studied the newcomers with a mixture of curiosity and instinctive unease. There was something about the way the humans stood, balanced, alert, their eyes constantly scanning the room. Something about the way they moved, smooth and controlled, like predators pretending to be calm. Then Admiral Harmon smiled. Several council members flinched. The expression revealed teeth, a display that most species interpreted as aggression or threat. But the humans seemed completely unaware of the effect they were having. Thank you for receiving us, Harmon said, her voice warm despite the unsettling expression. I understand you have questions. We will answer what we can. The first hour of discussion was awkward and halting. The council members asked about Earth, about human history, about why they had remained hidden for so long. Admiral Harmon answered patiently, explaining that humanity had been aware of galactic civilization for approximately 300 years, but had chosen to remain isolated. We had our own problems to solve, she said simply. Conflicts between our nations, environmental damage to repair, diseases to cure. We needed to become better before we introduced ourselves to others. And now? Ambassador Rillen asked. Why reveal yourselves now? Harmon's expression grew serious. Because we received your distress call. Because we learned that billions of innocent beings were dying, and that nobody could stop it. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. On Earth, we have a concept called conscience. It is the voice inside that tells you when something is wrong. When we heard your message, that voice was very loud. But why risk yourselves for strangers? North asked, echoing the question that had puzzled the council from the beginning. Your fleet is substantial, but not infinite. Your people could die fighting a war that is not theirs. What logic drives such a decision? Admiral Harmon exchanged a glance with her two officers. Something passed between them, an understanding that no words. Because someone has to, she said finally. The translator systems flagged the phrase as incomplete, possibly corrupted. It seemed to be missing context, additional explanation. But the humans offered none. Captain Santos spoke for the first time, his deep voice filling the chamber. Where we come from, there is a saying, evil wins when good people do nothing. We are not good people in every way. We have made terrible mistakes throughout our history. But standing by while innocents suffer is not something we can do. It goes against everything we believe. The council debated for several hours after the humans withdrew to rest. Some argued that accepting help from such a strange and potentially dangerous species was foolish. Others pointed out that they had no other options. A few suggested that the humans might be planning to conquer them after the HFY War. Defeated, it was Ambassador Rillen who finally ended the discussion. I have met many species in my long career, she said quietly. I have learned to recognize lies and hidden agendas. And when I looked into Admiral Harmon's eyes today, I saw neither. I saw something that I did not expect to see. Something that makes no logical sense. What did you see? Herrick asked. Rillen was silent for a moment, struggling to find the right words. She cared, the ambassador said finally. Not about payment or alliance or advantage. She heard that strangers were suffering, and she came to help. I do not understand it, but I believe it. The vote was not unanimous, but it was clear. The alliance would accept human assistance that night. As the human fleet took up positions alongside allied vessels, Lieutenant Cho stood at a viewport watching the stars. A young Varani officer approached him nervously. May I ask you something? The Varani said. Cho nodded. Are the stories true? About your homeworld? They say it is a death planet. That everything there tries to kill you. Cho smiled that unsettling tooth-showing smile. Earth is beautiful, he said softly. Green forests, blue oceans, mountains that touch the clouds. Yes, it can be dangerous. But that is what made us who we are. He turned to face the young officer. We learned very early that life is precious because it is fragile, and that the only way to survive is to protect each other. The Varani did not fully understand. But as he watched the human ships taking their places in the defensive formation, he felt something he had not felt in weeks. He felt hope. The combined fleet gathered near the Howrick system, preparing for the inevitable battle against the HFY War. For the first time in galactic history, human ships flew alongside vessels from 12 other species. And almost immediately, the problems began. Not problems of hostility or distrust. Those would have been easier to solve. The problems came from something nobody had expected. The humans were simply too different. Varani soldiers trained in strict schedules, requiring precise rest periods to maintain efficiency. When they learned that humans needed something called sleep, but could ignore this need for days through willpower alone, they were horrified. How could any species function while deliberately harming itself? Tannic engineers took pride in following established protocols exactly as written. Every repair, every modification, every adjustment had a proper procedure documented in technical manuals. When human technicians fixed a damaged power, coupling using parts from 3 different systems and a method that existed in no manual anywhere, the Tanoks nearly had a collective breakdown. And then there were the photographs. The insectoid Kreeth communicated through chemical signals and precise body movements. The concept of capturing a moment in a visual image and showing it to others was foreign to them. So when Lieutenant Commander Ryan Torres showed them pictures of his family back on Earth, his wife, his 2 children, his elderly parents, they simply could not comprehend what they were seeing. Why do you carry these images? A Creeth officer asked, his mandibles clicking in confusion. To remember them, Torres explained. To feel close to them even when I am far away. But they are not here. These are just light patterns on a screen. Torres smiled patiently. When I look at this picture, I can hear my daughter's laugh. I can smell my wife's cooking. I can feel my mother's hand on my shoulder. He paused, looking down at the image. Humans are not always logical. We connect emotionally to symbols and memories. It gives us strength. The Creeth officer studied the human for a long moment. You are very strange creatures, he said finally. We know. Torres laughed out as the days passed. A tentative respect began to form between the species. A Vorani tactical officer named Korath was assigned to work directly with the human command staff, and he found himself increasingly fascinated by their behavior. He noticed that humans touched each other constantly, a hand on a shoulder, a pat on the back, a brief embrace. Physical contact seemed to be how they communicated support and affection. He noticed that they laughed frequently, even in serious situations, as if finding humor was a way of coping with stress. And he noticed that they talked about their homes and families with a longing that seemed almost painful. Do you miss Earth? Korath asked Torres one evening. Every day, the human admitted. But being here matters. What we are doing matters. And knowing that my family is safe because we are out here fighting, that makes it bearable. You believe you are protecting them by fighting so far from home? Torres nodded slowly. If the Keth are not stopped here, they will eventually reach Earth. Maybe not for centuries, but eventually. Every battle we fight here is a battle, my grandchildren will not have to face. Korath was still processing this concept when everything. CHANGE, distress call came in from a convoy of refugee ships. Civilians fleeing the colonies that the Keth had already destroyed. The convoy was under attack, not by the swarm, but by pirates. Opportunistic criminals who saw the chaos as a chance to steal from the desperate. Alliance military protocol was clear. The fleet's priority was preparing for the Keth, diverting resources to protect. Civilian vessels would weaken their position. The logical choice was to ignore the distress call and let local security forces handle the situation. The humans did not agree. Before anyone could stop them, a squadron of human fighters launched toward the convoy. Captain Derek Santos requested permission to lead a boarding team against the pirate flagship. When permission was delayed by bureaucratic discussion, he went anyway. Korath watched the battle unfold on the tactical display, his heart pounding in a way he had never experienced before. Human fighters dove through pirate formations, drawing fire away from the defenseless transport ships. Santos and his marines breached the pirate vessel's hull and fought their way through corridor after corridor. The pirates were brutal and experienced. They outnumbered the marines nearly 3-1. But something happened that Korath did not expect. The humans did not stop. He watched Santos take a hit that should have ended any sensible being's participation in the fight. The human stumbled, blood spreading across his uniform, and then he got back up. He kept fighting. Another wound. He kept fighting. A third wound, and still he refused to fall. When the battle was over, every refugee ship had escaped safely. The pirate flagship was disabled and drifting. 12 Marines were injured, 3 seriously, and Captain Santos had to be physically carried to the medical bay because he refused to leave until he confirmed that every single civilian was accounted for. Fleet. Commander North was furious. The humans had violated direct orders, risked valuable military assets, and potentially compromised the entire mission. He demanded a meeting with Admiral Harmon to discuss disciplinary action. Harmon listened patiently to his complaints, then asked a simple question. Commander, would you have let those civilians die? North hesitated. Protocol dictates. I'm not asking about protocol. I am asking you, If you had been the one making the decision, with no rules to hide behind, would you have let innocent families be murdered while you had the power to save them? The silence stretched between them. No, North admitted finally. I would not. Harmon nodded. Neither could we? That is not a weakness, Commander. That is what makes us worth saving. Later that night, Korath accessed the historical archives and began researching human history in earnest. What he found kept him awake until morning. He read about 300 soldiers who held a mountain pass against an army of thousands, buying time for their people to escape. He read about civilians who had persecuted strangers in their homes, knowing that discovery meant death. He read about soldiers who threw themselves onto explosives to protect their companions, about doctors who worked in plague zones knowing they would likely become infected, about ordinary people who ran toward disasters instead of away. Time and again, throughout their entire recorded history, humans had chosen sacrifice over safety. They had fought impossible battles not because they expected to win, but because surrender was not an option they could accept. Korath found himself standing at a viewport, staring out at the human ships floating alongside the Allied fleet. Their vessels were still ugly, still primitive by galactic standards. But he understood now that appearances meant nothing. These creatures were not the monsters from the old legends. They were something far more extraordinary. They were beings who had looked at a universe full of darkness and decided, again and again, to be the light. He returned to Fleet Commander North's quarters and requested an audience. Commander, Korath said quietly, I believe we have been thinking about this situation incorrectly. How so? Korath chose his words carefully. We have been asking ourselves whether the humans can help us win this war. But that is not the right question. The humans are not here to help us win. They are here because letting innocents suffer is simply not something they can accept. They will fight until victory or death, and they will never stop trying. North studied him for a long moment. You sound like you admire them. I do not fully understand them, Korath admitted. But I am beginning to believe that understanding is not necessary. What matters is that when everything seemed hopeless, they came. And they are still here. Outside the viewport, the stars seemed a little brighter than before. The Keth swarm arrived 3 days earlier than predicted. When the massive bioships emerged from fold space, the scanner officers across the Allied fleet felt their blood run cold. The intelligence reports had estimated 3,000 enemy vessels. The actual number was over 10,000. A dark cloud of organic warships that blotted out the stars themselves. Moving with terrible purpose toward the inner systems, Fleet Commander North stared at the display for a full minute before finding his voice. All ships, prepare for emergency withdrawal. We cannot win this. The order made strategic sense. Fighting an enemy with such overwhelming numbers would be suicide. Better to retreat, regroup, and find another way to resist. Perhaps the inner worlds could be evacuated. Perhaps some survivors could reach the outer rim, but a single transmission cut through the evacuation orders. Negative on that withdrawal. Commander. Admiral Harmon's voice was calm, almost conversational. We have a plan. The Allied commanders connected to a secure channel, where Harmon shared the most audacious battle strategy any of them had ever heard. The plan was simple to explain and almost impossible to execute. The Keth swarm operated as a hive mind, controlled by a single massive organism at the center of their fleet. This command creature coordinated every ship, every attack, every movement. Without it, the swarm would become disorganized. Individual vessels acting on instinct rather than strategy. Harmon proposed using the human fleet as bait, drawing the Keth toward a dense asteroid field where their numbers advantage would be reduced. While the main battle raged, a small strike team would board the command organism and destroy its neural center. The assault team will need to hold the enemy's attention for approximately 2 hours, Harmon explained. That is how long we estimate the boarding action will take. 2 hours against 10,000 ships? A Kreef commander sputtered. That is not a battle plan. That is a death sentence. We understand the risks. You will lose most of your fleet. Harmon paused for just a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet but firm. We know, but if we retreat, billions more will die. The Keth will reach the inner worlds within weeks. Your families, your homes, everything you have built over thousands of years, gone. We did not travel across the galaxy to watch that happen. Captain Santos stood beside her, his arms still in a healing brace from the pirate battle. Admiral, my Marines are ready for the boarding action. 30 volunteers. We will get it done. 30 against an entire command organism? Norath asked. 30 is enough, Santos replied simply. The vote among the Allied commanders was brief. They did not like the plan. They did not believe it could work. But they had no alternatives, and the humans were going to proceed regardless. The Alliance would support them. As the fleet moved into position, something remarkable happened. Across every human vessel, screens displayed the same message. A call for volunteers to serve in the most dangerous positions. The frontline ships that would take the worst of the Keth assault. Every position was filled within minutes. There were more volunteers than spots available. Lieutenant Commander Torres was assigned to a forward destroyer, knowing that his ship would likely not survive the first hour. Before departing his quarters, he recorded a message for his family back on Earth, telling them he loved them and asking them to remember him. With joy rather than sadness. Then he reported for duty. The battle began at 1400 hours. Galactic Standard Time. Human ships formed a wall between the Keth swarm and the Allied fleet, their weapons blazing as the first wave of bioships crashed against them. The enemy was relentless, each destroyed vessel immediately replaced by 3 more. The humans held their ground. On the bridge of her flagship, Admiral Harmon coordinated the defense while damage reports flooded in from every sector. 1 destroyer gone. Then 2. A carrier losing engine power. Fighters being overwhelmed. She processed each loss and continued issuing orders, her voice never wavering. When an explosion rocked the bridge and her communications officer went down, Harmon pulled the young woman's body gently aside, took over her station, and kept working. There would be time for grief later. Right now, she had a fleet to save. Meanwhile, Santos and his Marines approached the Keth command organism in a specially modified shuttle. The massive bioship was unlike anything in galactic records, a living mountain of organic tissue, bristling with defensive organisms and connected to the hive mind by neural tendrils stretching across space. This is Santos. Beginning boarding action. They breached the outer membrane and entered a nightmare. The interior of the command organism was a maze of organic corridors, filled with warrior drones specifically designed to repel invaders. The Marines moved in tight formation, covering each other as they advanced deeper into the creature. Private First Class Hannah Kim led the demolitions team, carrying enough explosives to destroy the neural center. She was 23 years old and had joined the service because she wanted to make a difference. As she fought through the living tunnels, she thought about her parents back in Korea, about the letters she had written but never sent, about all the things she still wanted to do with her life. She kept moving forward anyway. The casualties mounted. 30 Marines became 25, then 20, then 15. Each fallen soldier bought the others a few more meters of progress. Santos took another wound but refused to slow down, leading from the front as he always had. When they finally reached the neural center, only 11 Marines remained, and they discovered that the explosives they had brought were not enough. Kim examined the massive neural cluster. her heart sinking as she calculated the energy required to destroy it. The charges would cause damage but not destruction. The hive mind would survive, weakened but intact. The mission would fail. She looked at her commanding officer and saw him reaching the same conclusion. "There's another way," she said quietly. Santos understood immediately. "Kim, no. My suit reactor can be overloaded. Combined with the charges, it will be enough." She was already removing the safety locks as she spoke. "Get the team out. You have maybe 4 minutes. I am not leaving you. You have to." Her hands were steady as she worked. Someone has to tell them what happened here. Someone has to make sure it mattered. The remaining Marines retreated, carrying their wounded as Kim stayed behind. She thought about her family one more time, about summer evenings and her mother's cooking and the sound of rain on the roof of her childhood home. Then she completed the overload sequence. The explosion tore through the command organism like fire through paper. Across the battlefield, the effect was immediate and dramatic. Kef ships that had been moving with perfect coordination suddenly faltered, colliding with each other, firing randomly. Losing all semblance of strategy, the Allied fleet surged forward. What had been certain defeat transformed into desperate hope. Human and Allied vessels fought side by side, pushing through the disorganized swarm, destroying enemy ships by the hundreds. The Kef, without their guiding intelligence, could not adapt. By nightfall, the battle was over. The swarm was not destroyed, but it was broken. Scattered remnants fled in all directions, no longer a unified threat. The Alliance had survived. Admiral Harmon stood on her damaged bridge, surrounded by exhausted officers and flickering screens. Her flagship had taken 17 direct hits. 3 decks were completely destroyed, but they were still flying. A message came through from Fleet Commander North. "Admiral, I do not have words. What your people did today." Harmon looked out at the stars, thinking about Torres and Kim and all the others who would not be coming home. "Neither do I, Commander," she said softly. "Neither do I." 1 month after the Battle of Howrux, the Great Hall of the Galactic Assembly was filled once again. But this time, the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of fear and despair, there was something that most of those present had never expected to feel again. There was hope. The war was not over. Scattered Keth forces still threatened the outer colonies, and it would take years to fully eliminate the remnants of the swarm. But the existential threat had passed. The Alliance would survive. Civilizations would continue. Children would grow up in a galaxy that still had a future, and everyone knew who to thank. The memorial ceremony brought together representatives from all 13 species, 12 original members of the Alliance, and 1 new addition. For the first time, humans stood among them not as strangers or myths, but as equals. As friends. The Great Hall had been modified for the occasion. Along the walls, holographic displays showed the faces of the fallen, human and alien together, those who had given everything so that others might live. In the center of the hall, a single flame burned in a transparent container, a human tradition, they were told, representing eternal remembrance. Admiral Lisa Harmon sat in the front row, her uniform crisp despite the healing wounds hidden beneath it. She walked with a limp now, a permanent reminder of the moment her bridge collapsed around her. Captain Derek Santos sat beside her, his left arm replaced by a sophisticated prosthetic that he was still learning to use. He had refused medical evacuation until every wounded Marine was transported first, nearly dying from blood loss before doctors could treat him. Lieutenant Commander Torres was not present. His destroyer had been lost in the 3rd hour of the battle, taking all hands with it. The message he had recorded for his family had been recovered from the wreckage and delivered personally by Admiral Harmon. Ambassador Rillen approached the central podium, her movement slow and deliberate. She looked out at the assembled beings and took a deep breath before speaking. "When I was young," she began, "my grandmother told me stories about monsters from the stars. Creatures that came from a death world, so violent and unpredictable that our ancestors had erased all records of their existence. She told me these stories to frighten me, to teach me that the universe was full of dangers." She paused, her gaze falling on the human delegation. "1 month ago, I learned that the stories were true. There really was a species from a death world. They really were capable of violence beyond anything we could imagine. And they really did come to our stars." Rillen's voice caught slightly, and she had to steady herself before continuing. "But the stories got one thing wrong. They told us to fear the humans. They should have told us to hope for them." She gestured toward the walls, toward the faces of the fallen. "These beings came across the galaxy because they heard strangers crying for help. They fought against impossible odds, not for territory or resources or power, but because they believed it was the right thing to do. Many of them died fighting for people they had never met, would never know, would never see again." She turned directly toward Admiral Harmon. "I asked you once why humans would risk themselves for strangers. You told me it was because someone had to. I did not understand that answer then. I think I understand it now." Harmon rose slowly and walked to the podium, her limp more pronounced under the eyes of so many witnesses. She looked out at the assembly for a long moment before speaking. "We did not come here to become legends," she said quietly. "We came because you asked for help, and answering that call is who we are." She paused, thinking about Torres and Kim and all the others whose names would be read today. "On Earth, we have a concept called community. It means that we are all connected, all responsible for each other, regardless of distance or difference. When one person suffers, we all suffer. When one person is saved, we all celebrate. My people have another saying that I want to share with you today." The hall fell completely silent. No one fights alone. Admiral Harmon looked around at the faces watching her. Alien faces. Strange by human standards, yet somehow familiar now. That saying used to belong only to humanity. After what we have experienced together, after what we have sacrificed together, I believe it now belongs to all of us. We are not 13 separate species anymore. We are one community, one family, bound together by something stronger than blood or borders." She stepped back from the podium, and the hall erupted in something unprecedented. 12 species rose together, making their various forms of applause and appreciation. The sound was strange and beautiful, a chorus of clicks and hums and patterns of light that somehow came together into a single message of gratitude. After the ceremony, Korath found himself standing next to Captain Santos on a balcony overlooking the city. The two warriors stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lights of Vareth Prime twinkle in the growing darkness. "What happens now?" Korath asked finally. Santos flexed his prosthetic hand, still getting used to the strange sensation. "Now we finish what we started. Hunt down the remaining Keth. Rebuild what was destroyed. Make sure this never happens again. And after that?" The human smiled, that tooth-showing expression that Korath had finally learned to read as warmth rather than threat. "After that, we figure out what it means to be neighbors. Maybe teach each other some things. Learn some things ourselves. Build something better than what came before." Korath nodded slowly. "You could have stayed hidden. Your species was safe, far from the Keth, far from our problems. Why did you really come?" Santos was quiet for a moment, looking up at the stars. "Because every child deserves to grow up without fear," he said finally. "Because every civilization deserves a chance to reach its potential. Because the universe is vast and cold and dangerous, and the only way to survive it is together." He turned to face Korath directly. And because when someone is in trouble, you help. You do not ask what it costs or what you will get in return. You just help. That is what it means to be human. Far away, on a colony world that had nearly been destroyed, a young Varani child lay in her bed, listening to her grandmother tell a story. The old woman's voice was soft and soothing, describing strange creatures from a distant world, beings who could survive anything and fight against any odds. But this time, the story was different. This time, the creatures were not monsters to be feared. And when all hope seemed lost, the grandmother said, "The humans came. They came from across the stars because they heard our call for help. They fought for us, died for us, and asked for nothing in return. They were scary to look at with their strange teeth and their predator eyes. But they had the biggest hearts in the entire galaxy." The child's eyes were wide with wonder. "Are they still out there, grandmother?" The old woman smiled, thinking about the ceremony she had watched on the broadcast, thinking about the human admiral who had spoken of community and family. "Yes, little one. They are still out there. And as long as they are, we are never alone." The child smiled and closed her eyes, dreaming of strange and wonderful friends from a distant world. Friends who had once been myths and legends. Stories to frighten children in the dark. Friends who had proven to be so much more heroes and very real in the darkness of space. Human and allied ships patrolled together, standing guard over a civilization that had been given a second chance. The stars continued to shine, indifferent to the struggles of the tiny beings beneath them. But those tiny beings had learned something important. They had learned that courage mattered, that compassion mattered, that choosing to help, even when it cost everything, mattered. They had learned what it meant to be human, and the galaxy would never be the same again.